there's like the mechanical aspect of it, which has been around for 100 or so years, and then there's like the psychological aspect of it, which I think Extinction Rebellion has done a good job trying to tell people about. And I'll just begin with a quote because I think it's very important to ground ourselves in what is required over the next year or two, because we all know what's coming down the line with regards to the science, and 2 degrees being locked in means that 5 degrees on land is locked in, and you can't grow food over 30 degrees, which means that there's going to be mass starvation, and much of that is already locked in. So what this is, the plan for October, and like a lot that comes like before that, is based on what's necessary. It's not really a tactic. It's what we have to do necessarily if you have a fighting chance. So the quote from Thoreau is that when we're faced with radical criminalities by our governments, the only place for a moral person is in prison. That's not coming from me. That's coming from someone who informed the main theory behind Gandhi's idea of nonviolence, and that's what informed Martin Luther King's idea of nonviolence and civil disobedience. And that's the lineage from which Extinction Rebellion comes. So I think it's important during nonviolent direct action trainings to tell people that, just to sort of let people know why we're here and to state the purpose of the gathering. So I'll give like the 4 logics of nonviolence and civil disobedience that need to be said. And before that, just one thing about nonviolence is that nonviolence is about having an intention to the action. So if you're at a bus stop and there are people there who are not talking, they're just not talking. They're not in a state of silence. But if you go to a group that's meditating together, they're in a state of silence. So there's an intention to it. And that's very important because there's a difference between not being violent and being in a state of nonviolence. Because if you're just not being violent, people can easily get out of hand. People might call the police officers pigs, and I'll talk about the police in a minute. And none of that is really helpful. And people knew that in the civil rights movement more than anything else, because they knew perfectly well that the main target is the government. And the same applies to Extinction Rebellion. Our main goal is to pressure the government, and in so much as that's not possible, is to cause enough pressure that results in the disintegration of the government. And the police is actually an important tool in that struggle, because the only way in which civil resistance struggles win is if the police tends to deflect. And based on the social science, we know that if you're nonviolent, you have a 55% likelihood of success. If you're violent, you have a 25% likelihood of success. And if you manage to be respectful towards the police and or whoever the authorities are, then you have a 60% chance of being successful. And so there are no guarantees, but it's just about probability. So the 4 logics to give people, the first one is disruption. The reason why we're going to be causing disruption in the lead up to October, and this will take the form of roadblocks and storms and blocking bridges and major intersections, major roundabouts. The reason why this is important is that we're trying to return to a more democratic form of, I guess, civil disobedience and emotional communication with the general public, where what we're doing is we're not doing something out in the woods, although all of that is very honorable and welcomed, and many of us have been arrested for those types of actions. What we're doing is we're trying to bring the fight onto the streets, and we're causing emotional disruption in people's lives, because that's what provokes people's rational faculties, and that's what makes people start thinking. So for example, when 1,000 people got arrested in the UK in 2019, thousands of people in their households were having conversations about what that means. And people were like, if 1,000 people are being arrested, that should mean something. And it provoked a national debate. And our goal for October is to provoking a national debate. And that's only going to happen if people are wondering why people are sitting down on the bridges, on the roads, and why thousands of people are getting arrested. So, and I'll talk a bit about storms in detail because we're starting that process in Vancouver right now. So the first logic is disruption, and I just gave you one reason for disruption. The other is that one of the goals behind a civil resistance struggle, and this is more specifically for October, is to bring the cost of disruption above the cost of negotiation. So you're disrupting to an extent where it's less costly for the regime to negotiate with you than let you be on the streets. And the second logic is the sacrifice logic, which often doesn't get talked about in nonviolent direct action trainings. And sacrifice is a very important aspect of civil disobedience, because by showing your community that you're willing to suffer for your beliefs, you're letting them know that this is not just people demanding stuff, that we have the resilience to suffer for our beliefs, which means going on hunger strikes, getting arrested, going to prison, and all sorts of stuff. And when we communicate that to the people, it makes it clear that we mean what we're demanding, and we're in this for the long run, because otherwise people are more likely to view it as a traditional campaign, and unless there's psychological sort of emotional pressure involved, where people are watching members of their cultural group or their class or their family getting arrested, that necessarily provokes an emotional response where they're more likely to come down and support you, or they're more likely to express support for you. And the third logic is dilemma. So one of the action designs challenges is to design an action that results in a dilemma for the authorities. So for the Spring Rebellion here in May, for Vancouver, what we did was our third day of action was an occupation of the Lionsgate Bridge. And what the police did was the police stopped people from getting on the bridge, but in order for the police to stop people from getting on the bridge, they had to arrest people for walking on the sidewalk. And so what that did was, even people who didn't agree with the occupation of a bridge, they had to sympathize with the fact that people were being arrested for walking on the sidewalk, which is perfectly legal. And that could only have been provoked if the level of disruption had been raised to a certain level. So that's something to keep in mind for a big event in October, is how do we provoke a backfiring effect? And when you do that, the police will act in illegal ways. And when the police act in illegal ways, it's more likely that the public will sympathize with you, even if they weren't initially going to agree with the bridge occupation or occupation of roads. So those are the four main logics. And there's one really important psychological aspect when it comes to civil disobedience actions, is that people should be willing to lead from the front, because initially there's going to be a lot of skepticism in your local chapters about the importance of getting arrested. So it needs to begin with 2 or 3 people, or just one person who is willing to get arrested, despite the fact that no one else is willing to get arrested. And when you do that, you can then go around telling people, here's why this is important, and here's why it works. So there's a paradox involved here, which is that the only way in which you can get a lot of people out into the streets is if a few people go out there without worrying about how many people you're going to get out into the streets. And so it's the idea of a prophetic promotion and a sacrificial orientation, where we tell people that we're going to be doing something regardless of how many people show up, and we're willing to suffer for our beliefs, we're willing to get arrested, and we're willing to pay whatever price there is to pay. And then you can, in nonviolent direct action trainings, you can have testimonials where the first people to get arrested can give talks. So in the lead up to May in Vancouver, we didn't have a lot of people getting arrested at our actions. We had 1 person getting arrested, 2 people getting arrested, 3 people getting arrested. But then we had a schedule of talks where people would give testimonials of why they got arrested and what that made them feel afterwards. So for example, someone gets arrested, and then they come out of the jail, and then they're greeted with food and water and people who are proud of their achievement and proud of the fact that they're willing to enter into civil resistance to the point of arrest. And so it's a feeling of entering into a community and almost a burden being lifted off of your shoulders. So people as we all know, people go around carrying a lot of climate anxiety, and arrest is actually a way to show yourself and to your cultural group that this requires our willingness to experience suffering. And that's another important thing, is that people will get a lot of backlash for the whole point of being arrested. And the thing to know here is just history of civil disobedience, because what we know from the civil rights movement was that they weren't just getting arrested because they were Black, because that's often the liberal idea, is that they were Black, they were getting arrested, they kept on getting arrested, then things changed. But the Martin Luther King orientation was that you can actually proactively create a dilemma for the authorities. Where in the civil rights movement, they used to have nonviolent direct action trainings where people would sign up for being arrested, and they would have trainings where they would say, okay, we're going to go into this action, and our purpose is to show the violence of the state. So the police will get violent, and we will get beaten up, and we want people to volunteer to be in the front lines. And so they would have training for people. People would sign up for arrests, and they would have organized arrests to quite a large extent. And if you watch the documentary, the PBS documentary on the Freedom Riders, you learn about this, where there was, in the case of the Freedom Riders, there was an explicit intention to provoke violence. Because what they were doing was they were well aware, and if you watch this documentary, there are people who are still alive who are giving testimonials of the fact that they were willing to even die sometimes, where they were like, okay, yeah, we will go into the South, and there's a high likelihood that our bus will be caught and people will be burnt alive and all sorts of stuff might happen. And a lot of this did happen. People were beaten around. And it was only when 500 people got arrested in the Freedom Riders campaign to the point of imprisonment that there was major legislation introduced in order to desegregate busing. And the thing to know here is that there was a binary number out there that they didn't know of, but that number was 500 arrests to the point of imprisonment. And after 100 people got arrested, after 200 people got arrested, 450, 490, no one really cared. But the moment it got to 500, it was a bit too much. And at that point, they had to sort of agree with what the demand was, because the government at the time saw this as a nuisance and they just wanted it to get out of their way. And we will be in a similar position here for October and for the fall, with the election being called and with COP happening. Because with COP and with the election season, the spotlight will be on the government in terms of the reputational cost of civil disobedience. So if there's a major reputational cost, there's a higher likelihood that you'll get your demands. So yeah, a reputational cost is extremely important when it comes to civil disobedience. And after the four logics of civil disobedience, there's also like three main logics of a rebellion event. One of them is to close down the city. So you occupy 4 different sites for many days. It doesn't really matter if you're camping out there, as long as you're coming to those sites day after day for 7 to 14 days. And one reason is closing down the economy, which you do by occupying those sites. The other reason is that if you're having hundreds of arrests or thousands of arrests, that results in an overburdening of the judicial system. So that's the second factor. And the third factor is a reputational cost because of the election season and because of COP. So it's a combination of these three things that needs to happen at the same time that's going to have a nonlinear effect. So the thing to know here is that you can't draw a linear line between starting a campaign and then being successful. So you'll just keep getting arrested day after day, day after day. You'll be losing, you'll be losing, you'll be losing. And then if you win, then you'll win all of a sudden at the same time. And that's the thing to know, is that it goes up dramatically. The likelihood of success goes up dramatically if there's persistence and if it goes on for day after day. One thing we're doing in Vancouver to sort of lead up to this event is that we are sort of having meetings with the police to let them know about our weekly swarms. What the swarms are is that every Saturday, 5:30 p.m., we are meeting at Robson Square in Vancouver, and we are going on to the streets, to the roads, to do 2-minute roadblocks for new rebels, just to train them on civil disobedience. So if there are new recruits, someone is action coordinator, someone is talking to the police, there's a police officer there to make sure that no one's, the police drivers aren't sort of intimidating people or getting violent or anything like that. So we're on the green lights for like 2 minutes, then we're off. And then that's a good way to train people in leadership skills and to enter into coordinating roles. And then you can divide people up into affinity groups, and you can tell them to show up at a certain time on a certain site during the rebellion or during the National Days of Action. So that's a good way to sort of divide people up into small sort of tight groups of what we call affinity groups or arrestables who can show up to an event together, and they have each other's back. One of them can be a legal observer, one of them can be an action coordinator or an affinity group coordinator. And this way you can sort of build a good sort of base of people that even if not a lot of people show up, a certain base of people will show up. So with the roadblocks, obviously you're going to go onto the road as soon as the light turns red, then the light will turn back green, and then you can be on for 1 green light, then get off again, and then get on again maybe for 2 green lights. And during that time, you need to make sure there's someone there who is offering food to people in the cars. Most of them won't accept the food, but the point is that if someone is offering you something, it's more difficult to be rude towards them or to be aggressive towards them. So that's mainly the reason behind that. And the other reason is to sort of let people know about the rebellion, because this alone will generate momentum if you're doing it week after week and saying that it's a lead up to a big rebellion event. So it's a way for people to just get connected with the organization and to like let you know what roles they're able to fulfill for the main event. And just to give like a few more historical examples, the model, as we all know, we're following is called the Global South Civil Resistance Model. And it's something that's historically been used in the Global South to bring about structural change, where if people are faced with a tyrannical government, they go down to the capital cities or the major cities and they occupy the city centers for day after day for a few weeks. Hundreds of people get arrested, and then you're in the ballpark of major legislative change or regime change. But this only works if people are going in with a virtue ethics orientation, meaning there's a lot of Western social movement fatigue where people sort of get nervous about, oh, I don't know how many people will turn up, and I don't know how effective you'll be. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe you should call it off. But the thing to know is that even if you have 10 people, it's worth doing it because it's the right thing to do. And it's that confidence that's going to inspire people to come onto the roads and join you. So the next step in a nonviolent direct action training is to do a de-escalation training, where you tell people how to deal with the police. So letting people know that yelling at the police is only going to hurt getting to a point where you can reach a critical mass. So the thing to know here is that the only reason for a communication protocol with the police is to reach a point where we can have people doing civil disobedience in a way where it's safe for everyone. And after that, if you get to a critical mass where it's 500 people, 1,000 people, then you can start flexing your muscles. You can be a bit more ambiguous about your relationship with the police. But in order to get to that critical mass, it's important that we make sure that it's a safe event for elderly people, for very young people, for disabled people. And the best way to manage that is to offer some form of predictability to the liaison officers so that there isn't an overreaction. And because if there is an overreaction, the first people you're going to lose are going to be marginalized groups, very old people, very young people. And the moment you lose that, there's a high likelihood that the movement will sort of descend into some form of violent movement, because the moment these groups sort of move out of the movement, it sort of becomes a young guys movement, and that's like just more likely that it's going to get violent that way. So just to emphasize to people and to do a rebel agreement during an action where we tell people that we're not here to blame or shame anyone, and just to remind everyone why we're here, what the theory of change is. The police is not the enemy. And if there is someone who is maybe agitating people, having a marshal over there who is trained in sort of de-escalation and going up to someone, and preferably someone who is quite old and respectable, if that makes sense, who can go up to someone and tell them that they're not welcome anymore or they should sort of behave properly. If a young person goes up to someone and tells them to behave properly, you're more likely to escalate it. So it's better if we sort of exploit the cultural norms of people sort of being more respectful towards elderly people and having those people in the front of the movement. So it's really a movement of very young people and very old people in terms of who needs to be in the front lines and needs to be in the face of the movement. So yeah, one example that we have of the civil resistance model working in the global north is the idea of the French uprising that happened in 2018. Whatever you may think of their politics, you had a point where 10,000 people got arrested. And at that point, the police went to the government and said that they weren't going to police anymore unless they were paid more. And that's when the very next day, the president had to come on TV and say that major legislation will be introduced to deal with the concerns of the protesters. So that's one thing to know. And the other thing to know is this spring 2019 rebellion in the UK when 1,000 people got arrested. And at that point, the criminal justice system couldn't take it any longer. And the government had to agree to a meeting, and policing had to change dramatically in the UK since then. So yeah, the final thing to know is that arrest isn't a tactic, right? that's one of the biggest mistakes we make in civil disobedience movements is we tell people that it's a tactic in the sense that it's like something we do based on whether or not it's effective. But the fact of the matter is that we're in a unique situation with regards to our political atmosphere right now, because the fact that Western governments have locked in 2 degrees of global average temperatures means that they're facilitating a genocidal project. And when you're facing governments that are facilitating a genocidal project, our options become binary. We can either enter into civil resistance or we can be complicit in a genocidal project. And during these times, our options aren't easy, right? So if you looked at Nazi Germany in the 1930s, you only had 2 options, right? You could either give refuge to Jewish people who were escaping persecution, or you could be complicit in a genocidal project. So you could either enter into resistance and be persecuted by the state, or you could be complicit. And those aren't easy options, and it's a very horrible thing to say, but it happens to be true in our specific context. And we don't choose. We have to recognize as a community that we don't choose the problems that are inflicted on society, and we simply have to decide how we're going to respond. And we have to look at the history of how people have responded historically. So those are the main things to know: is to train people up in these sort of weekly swarm actions where you're stopping traffic for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and leading up to an event where there's some liaising with the police, where the police will probably just close down the roads for you. This is what's been happening in Vancouver, is that they've been diverting traffic away from the roads and the intersections, and we're occupying the center of the intersections. The police gives you 2 hours, and then after 2 hours, they make their first announcement. They make their second announcement, they make their third announcement, then they sort of approach you individually and start arresting people. And obviously it's different in each province. And my contact in the VPD is going to give me a few contacts for the police departments in Montreal and Toronto specifically, so that we can inform them that there's going to be a non-violent civil disobedience event. And the purpose of this is that you're not asking for permission, you're just letting them know what's going on so that they don't overreact, and so that you can get to a critical mass of where you need to be in order to be effective in the future. So yeah, I think those are the main points. And Brent will do like a short testimonial for why he got arrested in the past, and then we'll hand it over to Vic, who will do a Know Your Rights training.
Thanks, Dane. I'll try to be brief. So I think that I, as a child, was really worried about what we were doing to nature, and also I was sort of by nature rebellious. So I was always what people would call an environmentalist, and I began, working for NGOs, knocking on doors, that sort of thing. But I realized that that was not working. So I started getting arrested on Burnaby Mountain, opposing Trans Mountain, then called Kinder Morgan. And the last couple of years, I've been with XR trying to help Zane and other people organize. And I've been arrested a couple times with XR. I'm being sentenced this month for my latest one. But I've been able to continue working. I sometimes question why I'm still doing that, given the times we are in. But I've been able to continue doing that. I've been able to get outside of Canada without a problem. I'm really immersed in the community that we are as activists now, and just looking at the situation that we're in right now. I posted a video today on the Vancouver XR Facebook page entitled "The Arctic Apocalypse," and there are professor emerituses on, if that's a word, on that video, talking about the risks that we face. And it's truly shocking, even to me, someone who reads the papers all the time. We are in a dire situation. We have no choice but to do civil disobedience and to risk everything, really, because there is no future. The politicians are not going to do anything to fix this problem. That is not their focus. We as people have to rise up and force them to do what is needed to be done. So I just encourage you all to look deep in your hearts and ask yourselves what you can and are willing to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Brent. That was actually quite a touching contribution. Guys, my name is Vic Handa. I'm here on behalf of the British Columbia Law Union. Zane asked me to join today and talk a little bit about the importance of legal information and legal knowledge, knowing your rights in community organizing and when you're planning a collective action. Hypothetically, as if XR was, for example, going to provide a nonviolent direct action sometime in the next year, hypothetically, what I'm about to tell you might pertain to that. I want to begin by also saying what I will talk about today in no way constitutes personal or asserted legal advice to anyone, any member of this call. Both to understand, we call them KYRs, okay? They're Know Your Rights training. We have found, and I won't blab to you about it because I'm already going to do a lot of blabbing otherwise, against all measures, no matter where it happens in the country, when people who are engaged in civil disobedience know their rights, have taken even minimal precautions to protect themselves from both arrest and prosecution, they spend less time incarcerated, they face more favorable terms of arrest, they mitigate against all of the traumas of arrest, and it's much more regenerative for a collective if they know what they're getting themselves into. So that's how I want to begin. I both don't just want to do a quick overview of Know Your Rights, but given this is a workshop, I want to tell you in your own communities, because I can see, which is pretty fantastic, there's actually people calling in from all over the country, how to do Know Your Rights among your own groups, okay? And I think the word group is really important. Zane touched upon this briefly, but you know, as individuals, I hate to say this, but there's a futility in trying to exercise power. When you find like-minded people, whether it's a collection of 3 or a collection of 30, or, you know, Zane and I have been in basements and churches in Vancouver with 300. That's when you have the power, when you get the momentum, you start acting as a collective. The XR itself you guys will discuss tactics and how you get the critical mass and stuff. I'm not going to be talking about that today. But when you are going to be giving a KYR, remember there's 5 major points to a Know Your Rights training. Know Your Rights training is entirely legal information to be absorbed by members of a community group. It's important to, first of all, ground, not just saying, here's my name and all that kind of stuff, but ground the context. So as a matter of due diligence, I would tell all of you in earnest to frame everything as a hypothetical. Explain what a nonviolent direct action is in very simple terms, meaning it's a collective engaged in a form of civil disobedience that is nonviolent that can risk arrest, quite simply. It's a really fancy way to basically talk about a protest. And the first thing is to advise everyone often, in a roundabout way, let me talk about the 5 things. I'm just trying to reroute so this doesn't become out garbled because it's a lot of information to cover, guys. So the first one, like I said, is ground who you are and why the session is taking place. The second one is explaining the importance of assessing and deciding to risk arrest. Not everyone involved in every NVDA is going to risk arrest. I've met probably by now hundreds, if not thousands of people in BC alone who have risked arrest. You can take, it takes a lot of courage and commitment, but there's varying worries of the people, and that's to be expected. If you're going to deliver any kind of KYR when you're talking to people about risk and arrest, you yourself have to be at ease, and you yourself have to be very clear in what you're communicating. So when you're going to ask people to ask themselves, will I risk arrest in a nonviolent direct action? It's important to discuss 2 things. Likely arrestable scenarios. That means engagement with public and private property. That means the geographic location of an action. That means how they will interfere with, let's say, hypothetically, industrial or energy projects in the area. And also, it is always beneficial to acknowledge that the cost-benefit analysis for arrest is very much a personal decision. It's a very weak collective if anyone feels a modicum of pressure to be pushed to the front line and be arrested. I can tell you that. People really have to, people do, and I'll tell you, people do. And I've seen, like, you know, hipster 19-year-old students from UBC, and I've seen retired airline pilots, silver foxes themselves, risk to get arrested, but they come at that decision on their own. it's heartfelt the amount of integrity a group can exercise when they come to these decisions on their own. But when they make the decisions, they come together as a collective. The third thing is what to do before risking arrest. I think this is probably the most important one to cover. It's really important that anyone that's going to a nonviolent direct action have the phone number, the contact phone number of a lawyer or a legal support person to call in case of emergency. I tell everyone in black permanent marker to write this phone number on your person. And that means basically on your body somewhere, okay? That is really basic. People young and old, no matter their size or race or ability, can all do that, okay? You also remember that when someone's arrested, they're not alone. And that's important to remind people of that because arrest can be very traumatic. Arrest can particularly be traumatic for members of the BIPOC, Indigenous, and other communities who have more of a history of trauma with police. The number one thing you need to inform people is that they're no longer going to have control over their own bodies the minute they're taken into custody. They can be led by the back, by the arm, by the hands. They're often handcuffed. If they're psychologically prepared for that, you can we hope to minimize the trauma that puts on an individual. So let's remind people that hypothetically, if Zane and I go to a direct action together, Zane will be my legal buddy. So if hypothetically I'm arrested, Zane is tracking me, so to speak. Zane's taking a look at who arrested Vic. What's the badge number? For what reason was he taken in? Where is he being taken to? This is how we stay informed and we inform others. This is important because if I have immediate medication I need to take in the next 24-hour cycle, and that's very much something private, Zane will know. Zane will communicate that to whatever RCMP or VPD or Ontario Police Detachment I'm at. That's a right that all Canadians are due when they're in police custody, is access to medical care. And I'm going to tell all of you, it behooves you to inform people who are going through a KYR training to be rather forthright and inform others of their special needs or their medical conditions, because they won't have the agency to get that medical care or to advocate for themselves once they're in custody. That's very important to remember. So it's really what I'm saying is be informed and be keen on informing others. A key part of legal information is acknowledging the consequences of arrest and charge. Those consequences can touch upon issues of employment. Union and statutory contracts might have moral clauses or whatever it might be. And often those questions no one can answer. You have to tell people. We've told, Zane's been there probably half a dozen times, we have to tell people, find out before the day of the action. If you're a teacher or you're a daycare worker or you're whatever it might be, you have this responsibility to yourself. It can affect causes of immigration, okay? If you're an international student, if you're not a Canadian citizen, your varying immigration status can have an impact on the severity of the charge and what the outcome is for you legally. It's important to keep that in mind. Zane is not a good example of an international student who's been austere with arrests, okay? So I think you guys understand a little bit what I'm talking about. It's basically saying, hey, if I am deciding to engage in nonviolent direct action hypothetically, I need to have legal information on my body at all times. Why I need to write it on me, I'll explain in a minute. I also need to have a buddy there that knows at least my first name and keeps an eye on me when I'm being arrested so I can be tracked. Also, if I have any medical needs or special needs, I have communicated that to my legal body. Further, I've taken a minute to consider the consequences of my actions that day and the arrests, immigration, employment, etc. Really, what you're asking people to do is consider nonviolent direct action in the context of what are your goals as a movement and what are the other options. I'm doing my best to avoid generalizations, but it's important to always exhaust other options first, never rush into any one tactic. That's how you stay informed. So let's imagine now it's the day of a hypothetical action and I'm risking arrest. What do I bring? I bring only an ID, which shows my name, my address, and date of birth, and a pen and a paper. I, under no conditions, bring a cell phone of any kind ever. I don't have a wallet on me. I would avoid keychains, even if there's something pokey on it. Pokey could just mean if a police officer goes into your pocket after arrest and gets poked, well, that could be misconstrued as a weapon. Certainly no weapons of any kind. And you have to actually remind people of that. It could be a Swiss Army knife. It could be pepper spray in a purse, nothing of the sort. You do this to mitigate the risk of police accelerating charges against you. Again, the day of any hypothetical action, I have a phone number written on me. This is because everything that's on me personally is going to be taken into, when I'm taken into custody, is going to be taken off me. I'm going to say this 3 times. I'm going to begin by saying it now. It's important to impart on others the importance, the fatal importance of not speaking with the police. I cannot underscore that enough. So I assume XRL or whoever might have some kind of plan that they have an action. We're going to stick to the plan. I'll have something on my body as a contact info. And let's say hypothetically, unfortunately, I'm arrested. Like I said earlier, the decision to be arrested, I think, takes a lot of courage. And I've seen a lot of fantastic display of that courage in the last year or two in the climate justice movement in Canada. So if I am arrested, I have the right to know what I'm being arrested for. I can ask that. It will be at one time or another, either when I'm being read my rights or taken into custody, it will be explained to me. And you have the right to have that explained to you basically when you're being before you're processed, excuse me, when you're first arrested by the police. The police are going to question you. Again, only provide as much information that is on that original piece of ID I mentioned. Your name, your date of birth, your address. It's important not to talk to the police. And I know police are often charming and can have a warm presence. And after the rush and the immediate trauma of the arrest is over, you think it's just dialogue, but that's never the case. The police are there to garner information that can accelerate the charges against you and threaten your freedom, but most importantly, threaten the freedom of the other members in the group. That's the most important thing I think there is to remember. And I'll tell you this, once you're in custody, if you're put in the back of a van, if you're put in the back of a car, if you're put in a waiting area, it doesn't matter who else is in cuffs. If you do not recognize them from before you were taken into custody, you're to not to speak to them under any circumstances. Doesn't matter if they're sitting next to you in the cell. We have a long list of very savvy ways that the police jump from back of a van, with a little bit of stubble and cuffs on, extracting subtle information. How come you didn't get wet? You haven't been here all day? Well, then he knows you came in with a second group. Or who drove you in here? Was it Vic or was it Zane? Now he'll know who leadership is. Now he has reasons to tag a warrant and come to one of our homes. This is important to remember. It's just the police doing their job, remember. When you are arrested, you have the right to silence and you have the right to reserve counsel. Depending on the nature of the charges, there hasn't exactly been grand sweeping criminal charges against protesters in Canada, let's say, on the climate justice movement. I'm not to say there hasn't been criminal charges applied, okay? They have been. But often, I'm gonna give you an example. Hypothetically, previous civil actions, let's say in British Columbia and Vancouver, for example, where people were arrested, taken into custody, they were charged by the police for violating provincial law. It could be like basically the equivalent of Ontario's Highway Traffic Act, or even mischief. And they were processed and released about an hour and a half later. Processed means I'm arrested, read my rights, I'm identified, they question me a little bit, and they'll give me what's akin to like a speeding ticket or a parking ticket that explains when I'm to show up to court for answer for those charges themselves. Sometimes they'll even write in conditions of release. Now, those conditions of release are somewhat sticky because they might demand that you no longer take part They might demand conditions of release are basically stipulations the police can put on you until you are arraigned in court and you meet those charges at a later date. Now, we've had circumstances where people are asked to go to court 5 months later, sometimes 8 to 10 months later. So it's a big gap. As I mentioned, there's always a search that accompanies that's incidental to the arrest that police don't need your consent for once you've been arrested. That's important to remember. And like I said, Indigenous, BIPOC, LGBTQ, and others have to be conscious of that. This can be traumatic because they will be invading your personal space. Keep that in mind. And any property you have on you will be temporarily seized by the police. So if I have a cell phone on me, and I'll tell you what, for example, in British Columbia, police do not need a warrant once you've been under arrest and they've taken your cell phone to go into the cell phone. Now, if somehow they can open that cell phone, they're going to read through my emails. They're going to see who I've talked to, what I spoke about. They're going to see the organizing strategies. They might even get membership lists. That's the last thing you want to happen. This is a measure of self-protection. And I could even tell you at previous XR events, there's people specifically tasked with providing imagery and video coverage of it for media. Frontline people engaged in NVDA who are risking arrest are not them ever. So you're likely to be released under your own undertaking, given the severity of the charges. Again, this is presupposing a hypothetical non-violent direct action. Okay, that speaks to the nature and severity of criminal charges that could be applied. And if you are charged, I'm not going to be talking about that really today because that's another process entirely. That's when, Zane could talk about that a little bit, but often people are tasked with individual lawyers to meet those charges and to mitigate against them. There are public resources to share with people. Most provincial civil rights organizations have KYR, Know Your Rights booklet, I know the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, BC Civil Liberties Association has something like that. And that's publicly available on websites. If we're going to take it into Q&A now, I suggest we no longer record the session just to protect everyone's privacy in case you're